Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos on YouTube. Ron, you are a digital marketing strategist, but you also have a background in politics, history, and economics. You were shortlisted as a mayoral candidate in London and have studied at the LSE and Oxford. But the reason why we're speaking today is because you have launched an extraordinary counter-propaganda campaign after the war in Ukraine began. When did the campaign launch and what motivated you to start it?
So we started straight after the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. And we did it for a simple reason, which is Vladimir Putin is terrified of the truth. He knows that if ordinary Russians find out what's happening in Ukraine, it will be extremely damaging to his popularity. And in fact, he may lose power. People in Russia do not largely know quite how badly the war has been going in Ukraine, or how unpopular the invasion is with Ukrainians. The Russian propaganda has been that people were begging to be invaded, and of course that is nowhere near the truth. The problem, though, of course, is that Putin has completely crushed independent media in Russia. Everyone who works in independent media has had to flee the country, and he's tried to censor Russians' access to real news about what's going on in Ukraine. So our idea was to use digital advertising to take that news back into Russia so that Russians could find out what was going on in Ukraine. So the day after the invasion of Ukraine, we started doing digital advertising in Russia and a little bit later in Belarus, showing people what was happening in Ukraine and helping people to get independent news about what was going on. To do that, we've assembled a huge squad of people who work in the advertising and marketing worlds, who make ads. We have people working on how you crack the censorship systems. Obviously, we've had to fundraise a lot for that. And so far, we've shown about 250 million ads into Russia.
Fantastic. And do you see this as a humanitarian effort to end an unjust war faster, or are the motivations broader? Do you consider that we are actually at war with Putin's regime?
Well, ultimately, his regime is the problem, not the Russian people. The Russian people have very little say over what's going on in Russia. The elections have been rigged for some time, and it's very hard to have opposition to Putin. So ultimately, really, we're trying to make sure Russian people get to make up their own minds. And we expect that if they do, the war in Ukraine will end quickly. The Russians tend to see Ukrainians as being very close to them culturally. And so most Russians are horrified when they discover that the invasion is not welcomed by Ukrainians, because their propaganda is telling them they're actually helping Ukrainians. Equally, most Russians remember the horror of previous wars that have happened in Russia and don't want to see Russian conscript soldiers getting killed over a completely pointless war. And I think Putin knows that one of the contributing factors to the end of the Soviet Union was discontent in Russia about the war in Afghanistan during the 1980s. And so he's very keen not to see the war come back as an issue of controversy.
So your aim is to show independent news about the war in Ukraine to Russians, the kind of information that most Russians don't get to see, and you're using digital adverts to get around Putin's censorship. So in practical terms, are these ads visible through Google and Yandex, the main search engines that Russians use?
Well, I guess in the eyes of the Russian government, we're running a criminal organization. So we are obviously trying to outwit them. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game. We have to always get around all that censorship in one way or another. So we don't actually reveal where we put our ads to anybody so that it's harder for them to find them. What we can say, though, is that you can buy digital advertising in all sorts of places in the modern world. And if there is any way you can buy advertising, we will be trying to buy it at some point. Now, each place we buy the advertising is a different technical challenge to get around the censorship. So obviously to do that, you've got to find ways to get people to accept your ads. You've got to find ways to get them money. There's a whole set of technical things you have to get over. But in principle, if we can buy an ad somewhere, we will. Now, to give you an example, if you go around London at the moment, you can buy advertising on the tube, on those little electronic panels that appear as you go up and down an escalator. And we would attempt that if we could, and if it would reach the right audience. So over time, one of the things we've discovered is we have never been banned from the platform successfully over time. Sometimes a specific ad gets banned. Sometimes our account where we pay for things gets banned. But on the whole, we seem to be able to get around censorship, and we're pretty confident we're going to be able to get around censorship indefinitely.
So I'm going to ask some fairly sort of geeky questions here, because I work in digital media as well. So the mechanics of this are kind of fascinating to me. So would you use, say, what are called programmatic platforms? That's advertising placement where you have algorithms that do a lot of the thinking, a lot of the placement, or are you talking about a fairly manual operation? And I imagine if you're playing cat and mouse, it could be fairly intense to do all this manually.
We are trying it any way we can get it through to people. And there is quite a lot of fiddling to make sure we keep on being successful the whole time. And that's why we have got a set of volunteers who help us. I'm not even quite sure how many there are now, because there are so many, but I would say it's probably well over 60 now. And one group of those volunteers are people who are expert on all sort of technical aspects of digital advertising. And so, of course, they're constantly finding ways to get around Putin's censorship. Now, I think one of the things that helps us, there's two things that help us. First one of which is digital advertising is phenomenally complicated. I have worked on the edge of the digital advertising world for most of the last 20 years now. And I constantly discover new things that I didn't previously understand. I find out whole new areas I don't understand at all. And I found out the things I thought I understood have changed since I last had any connection to them. So it's phenomenally complicated. And the Russian government isn't very well set up to deal with that. Partly to get a good handle on it, you need to spend time trying to do your censorship properly. You need to employ people to do it, and need to spend money. And the Chinese government has clearly spent the last 15 years doing that. So their censorship is much more effective. Russian government is actually used to just telling people what to do. And that relates to the other problem Russian government face, which is that Russia is fundamentally very corrupt. And so most organizations in Russia, if they've broken the law or ignored a rule at some point in the last 10 years, they may well have paid a bribe rather than actually obeying the law, because it may just be easier to pay a bribe. And therefore, organizations are not used to thinking of complying with rules. Neither is the Russian government necessarily very good at knowing how to enforce them, because really it may be that your people who have to enforce it are used to ringing people up and saying, you've broken a rule, and the person says, yeah, here's $10,000 to go away. That doesn't make for a very effective government. And so all of that, I think, means that the Russian censorship is not highly effective. And I'm sure if we were doing this in a different country, we would be having many more problems. I'd also know it's quite interesting when I listen to people at Bellingcat talk about working in Russia. One of the things they say is they find it very easy to prove where Russian soldiers are in Ukraine, because if they see a photo of a Russian soldier, every database of Russian soldiers has been sold on the dark web. And therefore they can cross-reference those databases to photographs and work out what regiment somebody's in and which bit of Russia they're from, and have they been in Syria and stuff like that. But Bellingcat again say that fundamentally, because Russia is so corrupt, that actually undermines their effectiveness as a system.
And of course, it's been said that a lot of Russian soldiers have taken their mobile phones with them. So they're uploading footage of themselves onto TikTok and so on. And I don't know if you saw the data set as well, where they actually tracked the postal deliveries of looted goods and where those were going. So it does seem that the West and the Ukraine have overtaken Russia in terms of digital hybrid warfare. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I'm not a great expert on that, but I think one of the things I noticed, I think we've seen far more from the Ukrainian perspective, because the Ukrainians have generally encouraged people on their side to film and publish stuff. And while some Russian soldiers have been filming themselves, actually the interesting thing for me is most of them have had their phones confiscated because the Russian government's scared about them phoning home and telling their friends and family how awful it is. So I think the side effect of that for their propaganda has been that when the Russians succeed at something, film footage of that doesn't come back and go online nearly to so much as it does from the Ukrainian side.
So your ads, I think you mentioned, have been seen 250 million times. How many unique users or unique people do you think you've been able to reach?
It's very hard to know. Even if we're doing this in Britain, if you advertise in more than one place, it's quite hard to actually tell you've got the same person once and it's not two different people. There are extra barriers we face operating a slightly more covert campaign that make it hard to count that. If I was to guess, it's probably well over 5 million people. It could be at 50 million people, but we really don't know right now. We have indications from some of the different places where we're advertising on what would say 5 million is probably a sort of lower bound at the moment, but we can't really tell. And all the ways in which we would measure would probably expose people's privacy in a way that might not be ethical for us to do. In other words, if I note that a particular person in Moscow has seen 15 ads, it might be helpful for my analytics, but if that data ever leaks, that's not helpful for that person who lives in a dictatorship.
So how do you protect people? I was going to ask this one a little bit later on, but it seems important to ask this question now. Your ads, I assume, reach people who are using a VPN, but they also reach people who are not using a VPN and therefore don't have that kind of level of protection. How do you ensure that people in Russia won't get into trouble if their internet history is browsed and they've, say, seen your ad, clicked through, interacted, say, once or more?
The key thing is we are mainly directing people to sites that we don't control. So we're not gathering any data on them as individuals. And that's a big protection, obviously. When we are in a situation where we can collect data, we don't, again, to do that. And then the third thing is scale. Again, it's possible to persecute a few thousand people, but part of our point is to get to tens or hundreds of millions of people. And therefore, that becomes impossible to go and use that data, because if 20% of your country have seen the information, you can't go and arrest and knock on the door of 20% of people. And we do think very carefully about this as we do different things to make sure we don't accidentally leave that data trail. We also, of course, just in case we accidentally did gather data on anyone, we have very cautious security to make sure that it's very hard to get into any of our systems to find out anything that's going on. And in fact, out of the, let's say, 60 volunteers we have, only 4 of us are actually in the public domain. Everyone else has chosen to remain private. So we're also protecting our volunteers' privacy as well.
Fantastic. Now that sounds like a very strong set of policies there. obviously, there's an effort to block your ads and block different formats, and you have to change that. Are you sending people to different types of websites? Do they also have to change the kind of the so-called sort of landing destination? Is there an effort for those sites to become blocked as well?
Yeah, so they've Russia now sequentially blocks all the major independent news websites. However, the challenge they have is Russia can't block Telegram, which is one of the main apps used in Russia. And so all of these sites have significant Telegram channels and websites that are updated every few days as they get blocked down. And technically, the way the mirrored websites appear means that it's slightly harder to block them. So each mirrored site will survive for a few days, and then people will go back to, I don't know, the Medusa Telegram channel and get the new mirrored link when the old one has been blocked. So that's a particular challenge for the Russian government. And so that means that while somebody who isn't determined won't be able to go just to the old Medusa website, people can still moderately easily get it via the Telegram channels.
And Medusa is one of the main, I wouldn't even necessarily call them opposition, because clearly they're trying to be objective. They're one of the main alternative news outlets. Is that the kind of site? Are you able to name some of the other sites? I mean, I also know that the Navalny's team are producing some excellent material, but that could be construed as perhaps more political. What are your policies on where you send people?
Our general principle is either to show people news directly that we have vetted, or to go to independent media sources. Partly it's a principle of allowing people to make up their own minds. And then the other one of which is really, we want people to maybe end up on an independent news website and think this is great, read 5 pages, but then come back to it a few days later and sustainably visit there. So that's our idea. So we wouldn't generally do it to anyone like opposition. It would only be to people who have news. Funny that you mentioned Navalny. Actually, he has called for a campaign that's basically what we're doing, which is, and his point is, look, if you spent the cost of one missile a day on a campaign to bring independent news into Russia, that would allow you to basically show everyone in Russia a few ads every day. And therefore it would start to become very, very hard for Putin to control that. Now, our funding level isn't quite at that level. We've probably spent less than £1,000 a day. What he's talking about is probably about 100 times that level. So what we would like in future to hope to get is enough funding to really go up to that scale, so that people constantly see our ads as we roll that, as we scale up.
And that really raises an interesting topic. I was listening yesterday to a fantastic lecture given by Peter Pomerantsev, and he was describing the information warfare that Britain engaged with in the Second World War, which was clearly extensive, well-funded, and very sophisticated. Why do you think we're not doing this kind of stuff? Why do you think our governments are not really investing in this area at the moment?
I think the fundamental problem is probably that the policymakers aren't very digitally savvy. And so, for instance, I saw a story briefed into a newspaper a few weeks ago that implied that videos of Boris Johnson were being shown on VK, which is one of the main social networks in Russia. And I strongly suspect that's wrong. I suspect something has been tried by the British government, but there are 2 things that smell fishy to me about it. Firstly, I suspect the idea that the video of Boris Johnson would get through their censorship on VK is actually quite unlikely. And secondly, if you were to do that, he is a very poor messenger to try and persuade Russians of things. So it sounds to me that either that things are being tried that aren't really working, but quite often whoever the politician is who's briefed out that story for newspapers doesn't really understand what they're doing. And on the whole, I think a lot of the skills to do this well, there aren't many people doing it in government. When government needs people to do digital advertising, they tend to use external agencies. But also probably means I'm not convinced they have great skill sets. But also, I'm not sure the politicians are necessarily very well set up to ask the right questions. So I suspect that's part of the problem. I think the other part of the problem has probably been it's very easy to announce you're giving military support to Ukraine. It's very tangible. This is going to, by its nature, be very intangible. And to do a good campaign, you're going to have to keep a lot of your techniques secret. So it's not going to look that exciting politically. Though that said, I very much hope that Western governments give us funding, because we could scale up a lot if they did.
I guess the other thing, because I spoke to Jessica Aro as the second interview in this series, and of course she's researched extensively Putin's troll factories that were created in Olgina. And I guess the other thing about this is you can't just bring a digital operation into existence in days or even weeks. The Russian sort of troll factories have been in operation for 10 or more years, going back to the invasion of Georgia and so on. And those techniques in themselves were built on previous I would say propaganda, psychological techniques developed in the Soviet Union. So I don't know if you can talk about the challenges of actually setting this infrastructure up.
Yeah, well, I think part of it, a lot of it's skill-based. So some of the most useful people to us, from a point of view of Putin, we are a criminal spam organization. And some of the most useful people we've worked with have worked doing things like gambling advertising, because they've got the devious brains to think about how do you get around rules and systems and the experience of doing it. And they've also worked on all the practicalities that you have to get through as well. And again, that's the sort of time, as you say, it takes time. Now, luckily enough, we've had a lot of volunteers who have done that in the past and therefore already have the skills. But I think that, again, that's the sort of thing, as you say, it's quite hard to set it up from scratch if you don't know anything about it, because you don't know what the sorts of skills are you need to go off and find. And we certainly, as our campaigns got on, it has got more effective over time.
Talking of effective, I mean, that's a great segue into the question I wanted to ask. The other thing about digital media is that it's a learning process, isn't it? You don't get the best results instantaneously. You analyze metrics, statistics, you try different things, different strap lines, different creative treatments. So without giving too much away, what have you learned through this campaign? What sort of formats, devices, times of day, are you able to test these things out and figure out what works better?
So first of all, partly because we're protecting people's privacy and partly because Russia's a dictatorship, there's a whole box of tricks that aren't available to us. So for instance, if you want to do an advert on YouTube in Britain, you can choose an audience of people to show it to, and you can do a proper randomized control test where you would in a vaccine trial, and 90% of people see the ad and 10% won't. And then afterwards, you ask them what they think of brands in the ad. You ask them, have you heard of it? Do you have a positive opinion of it? You ask them questions like that. And you compare the people who didn't see the ad and the people who did see the ad. And obviously, you just can't do that in this situation. So there's a bunch of things we can't do. What we can do is we can look at when our ads contain a video, how long do people watch it for? What proportion of people click through? What sort of price are we paying to reach people? And all of those indications tell us that on the whole, our ads are highly engaging. Now, there are two things going on here. The big one really is, I think there's a massive hunger in Russia to find out more about the war in Ukraine. So it's not that our ads have been made amazingly and are sort of creative, award-winning ads in that sense. What it is that people really want to find out what's going on in Ukraine. So when something catches their eye about it, they're more likely to watch it, more likely to click through and find out more. So that's a key thing.
So do you think some people are actually better informed than the propaganda would suggest they are?
Yes, and we know that for a few reasons. Firstly, there has been some polling done in Russia, and there's been some quite clever academic work to try and work out what proportion of people are, when you do clever techniques to find out whether or not people are concealing their true view because they're scared to reveal it. And those would indicate somewhere between a quarter and half of people in Russia are against war. So that's a good indication there is a large chunk of people who are getting independent information. Equally, we know there's been statistics on searches for VPNs in Russia. And again, after the war started, those went through the roof. The sorts of numbers I think we're talking about were around 1 million people a day looking for them, which again, if you accumulate that over several months, that's probably tens of millions of people who actually installed them. And then the other was more qualitative stuff. So when we look at Russian websites, there are quite a lot of memes in Russia that make reference to failures of the Russian military in the war in Ukraine. And those memes would only work if the people seeing them got the joke. And you can only get the joke if you know about these particular failures. So one of them, for instance, is about a sort of a particular village that Russia kept on saying it was about to capture, and it kept on not capturing it somewhere in the east of Ukraine. Another one was about Lukashenko in Belarus saying some pretty stupid things. A third one of which was about a Russian soldier who had been captured and appeared on Ukrainian TV, who I think looked particularly short and young. Basically, it looked almost like a kid, but again, probably a construct. There's a lot of these things that, if you ask yourself, they cannot work as jokes if people don't know quite a lot about what's going on in the war in Ukraine. So my suspicion is, by the way, nobody's done any of these polls for a few weeks now. So if anyone wants to invest in a poll in Russia, that would be a really interesting thing to do right now, to try and understand to a degree to which public opinion has moved. But I get the impression there is definitely a decent chunk of the population stuff's getting through to. And broadly, this is age related. Broadly, younger people are tech savvy enough to be getting around it. The more retired people, we probably have a more rosy view of the Soviet Union, particularly because they experienced the worst times of the 1990s afterwards, are probably both technologically less sophisticated and more sympathetic to Putin anyway. But there's probably a winnable middle ground of the middle-aged.
Yeah, so if we take that kind of demographic, the sort of those in the middle that might be swayed if they got the right information, and perhaps those who, as you say, were already in their 20s, 30s in the 90s. I mean, to us, it appears that Russian propaganda is crude, absurd at times, but that internal propaganda does seem to have been very effective amongst a certain portion of the population to align them behind the war. You mentioned anything from half to 3/4. How can ads cut through with a compelling and seductive message to that part of the population?
We're not going to convince people with one ad. What we can do is intrigue them to find out more, and either later search for the information by themselves or click through our ads to then end up somewhere else where they maybe end up on an independent news website, read 4 or 5 pages, then go back there a few days later, maybe subscribe to that website on Telegram, etc. And that's what our hope is we create those sustainable media habits. Again, quite tricky for us to measure and prove that we're succeeding in that, but the indicators we have seem positive.
So you're taking them on a journey, or at least in some cases, you're starting them on a journey to question their point of view.
And that's our hope. And I think, again, talking to people who are more expert on a region than me, I think a lot of them will say people know when they're being lied to, but people will still believe some of the lie. And so, for instance, I think, again, people say about East Germany in the 1980s is the ability of people in East Germany to watch West German TV was tremendously undermining, because they kind of all knew that West Germany was probably a bit better off. But when they started to be able to routinely just see, I don't know, a West German sitcom that was set in an ordinary home, and people had a car, they had a stereo, they had a lot of consumer goods, that was highly undermining. And I think there's probably the same thing going on here, is that people probably realize the war is going worse than expected, but still there's a way they can go to learn more and to realize quite how bad it is.
And to an extent, the sanctions, which we've been talking about for months, they haven't really kicked in fully, have they? They haven't actually hit the Russian economy hard, because, you know, shops, warehouses would have had, you know, supplies, several months of supply in waiting. So yeah, a few shops have had empty shelves and so on. But essentially, I hear a lot of Russian economists saying that the sanctions are really going to start to hit in June, July, August time. Would you expect that perhaps your campaigns would be more compelling to people when they start to feel the hardships themselves? So, for instance, when they can't get spare parts for their cars, and that's, you know, a huge crunch point coming up soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, some of the polling has been done. One of the things that came out from one of the polls where, and you again have to be careful interpreting these things, because people are always going to be more pro-war in the polls, they're scared to be anti-war. But you know, in polls where people were mainly pro-war, when asked carefully, while I am pro-war, it's not worth it economically. And I think that's going to be an interesting problem for Putin, which is it's quite hard to have, when people feel it in their own pockets, it's quite hard to counter that, because it's very real to people. And so therefore, I think the economy is going to be a very important part of this. Equally, I think the other thing says the number of people who have either been there fighting or emigrated, obviously over time keeps on going up. And the consequence of that is each one of those people will have a large set of friends and family who are, you know, in Moscow or St. Petersburg or anywhere in Russia, who then know their family member or their friend who's either in the war, has been in the war, hasn't been heard of for some time, or has emigrated and is sending them back news from the world outside. And again, you know, that might be, for every one person who emigrates, and I believe the number is maybe in the millions now of people who've emigrated, certainly hundreds of thousands. There's going to be tens of people they're in relatively close contact with. And again, cumulatively over time, that adds up. So even if you don't believe the first person who tells you, even if you don't believe your Ukrainian relative who tells you how awful it is, when you're being told by 5 different people who are outside the country how awful it is, or by your nephew who was in the army, I think that it does gradually over time break through.
And this is another one of the, firstly, Soviet and now Putin's sort of myths or propaganda tropes, and that is that everybody hates Russians, that it's Russophobia we're fighting. And I even heard, I think it was Margarita Simonyan yesterday, just making the point that, you know, Russians live really badly outside Russia and everybody hates us. There are, as you say, almost 1 million people now who have left the country, and I doubt whether many of them will be treated badly, and many of them will live considerably better when they settle down and find a host country. I guess these messages will start to percolate back as well.
Absolutely, and I think it's very important that Western governments welcome Russian immigrants, because actually the more successful they are outside Russia, the more that message will go back. And if they have a hard time, they may be forced to go back to Russia. I think it's worth knowing there's a lot of Russian immigrants who've only got to really the former Soviet Union, because there are a lot of Russians won't have an external passport. They'll only have what's basically an ID card. And there's a few of the former Soviet Union countries, I think Kazakhstan and Georgia are the main ones, where you can go to fairly easily with those, but there's not many. So I think anything the outside world can do to help that group will actually also help the effort to undermine Putin.
That makes a lot of sense. In terms of demographics, now a lot of the people leaving the country will come from the larger cities. A lot of them will have been from the younger, more professional class. But do you get a sense geographically of where your ads are reaching? Are they concentrated in large urban areas, or are you able to reach out to the provinces as well?
We're doing our best to spread them evenly across the entire country and across the entire population. But yeah, obviously, if you look at any list of where they show, the big cities show up highly. Moscow is a massive city, but really we get them from east to west, north to south. You can be in Sakhalin, or you can be in the Soviet Far East and the Russian Far East, and seeing our ads as much as you could be in Moscow. I suspect the danger to Putin politically is probably from our ads more in the cities. But also the other thing I was saying is many of the ways in which we deliver ads mean we won't get very much good data on that. So yeah, it's sometimes hard to tell.
And reading some of your articles in the media industry, I can see you've written in Adweek and The Drum about the relationship between war, oppressive regimes, and ad revenues. I was intrigued by that. Can you explain the connection between these?
Well, I think on the whole, the interesting thing is that the people like Putin don't get their money from advertising. They get their money from oil. Yeah, and in fact, the people at the top of the sort of Putin's network, none of them really get internet stuff because it's hard to steal the money. Actually, there's incredible technical skills required to set up a successful internet company. While actually, if you want to just become rich by looting the economy, you go and buy an oil field or threaten to shoot somebody unless they give you an oil field. So I think that's quite interesting, is that they have, I don't think they necessarily really understand it very well. And to the degree to which they understand it through things like the troll farms, which are really about picking fights with people. It's a very destructive way of communicating. Now, the advantage of that, of course, for them is that's quite easy to do. The disadvantage is, in the long run, the truth will be to lie when they're head to head. Now, that's not to say that smears and lies can't sustain for a very long time, but I think what they don't know so much is how to positively tell their side of the story. So they're quite good at undermining other people, but they're not really doing anywhere near as good a job as they could be on that. And I think that's why, if you look globally, there is so little support for them. Their list of supporters is extraordinarily weak. They could have probably done a better job, actually, of mobilizing the rest of the world on their side. But I think partly they don't know. They were quite cleverly, the West, by revealing that they are about to invade Ukraine, made it much harder for them to sell a narrative of being attacked by Ukraine, which is, I think, what they wanted to have done.
That's a fascinating point of view there, because clearly the troll farm kind of approach doesn't work when the truth is almost, blatantly clear to almost everyone what's going on. But if we look back at 2016, their cyber operations seemed to be much more successful when they were latching on to actual schisms, actual debates within the West. So whether that was Brexit, US presidential election, Scottish independence, they're latching on to real divisions and real issues.
And that's exactly the point, I think, which is actually those things didn't happen because of Russia. The Russian government just piggybacked on things that were happening already. And they were piggybacking on people who were willing to take the side of their side. And broadly speaking, I think the interesting thing is, if you look at vaccines in Britain versus the United States, in the United States, there is a large chunk of the media who are willing to say completely irresponsible things on vaccines and to reward politicians who jump into that as well. And the problem with that, it means vaccination has become politicized. And the problem with that is, well, if 20% of the country are willing to back whatever Trump and his loonies say, then you've got 20% of the country who are going to oppose vaccines because of that. While in somewhere like Britain, the combination of public service broadcasting and the fact that no major political party in Britain is willing to do that completely unethical thing, means we have a very different sort of, we've had a very successful vaccine rollout where the vast majority of people have taken a vaccine. You know, it's close to 100% of people in older age groups. And in most age groups, it's a vast majority. And I think that's a huge strength of systems that have public service broadcasting, but it's also a huge weakness of somewhere which has a political culture like America, where for one reason or another, you can get rewarded for saying completely mad things because there is a large chunk of media collude in that.
Absolutely, and to an extent, even though if you look at the polls where people were asked whether who started the war, who do you blame primarily for it, and I think the UK is probably one of the most clear cut in that respect. But if you look at places like Bulgaria and even Greece, Hungary, it's not quite so clear there. So do you think Russia's digital operations are now focusing a bit more on countries where they can actually cut through? I also hear they're investing a lot in their digital warfare within Africa. And these are perhaps areas that we don't really concentrate on much.
I've heard that, but I'm not an expert on it. So I honestly don't know.
I've only got sort of a couple of questions left here. I'm really fascinated. Before we do a big plug for your campaign and try to sort of drum up more supporters, how do you think your operation fits into the ecosystem of digital resistance to tyranny and this war specifically? So for instance, you've got Bellingcat, you've got Inform Napalm, which is a Ukrainian outfit. So
my basic thought on that is that far too much effort has been given to countering disinformation. It is very, very hard to stop a dictatorship using disinformation because there are loads of grey areas. A lot of the time, they could just boost things that are true but non-representative. Yeah, and in a modern world, if you are in a fight against anybody, you can find one member of the other side who has done or said something terrible. Yeah, but that's just very, very straightforward to do. So disinformation is sort of inevitable, but the way you beat it isn't to spend your time refuting it, is to inoculate people against lies with the truth. And again, I think one of the not much recognized successful parts of the British vaccine program has been not to go around debunking vaccine myths. It's been to, well, some people use pre-bunk. Yeah, in other words, show people the truth before they see the lie. And the first thing you know tends to be the most influential. Changing people's minds once they've seen a lie is way harder than inoculating them with the truth beforehand. So a huge effort went in the British vaccine campaign to explain to people how were the vaccines made and developed safely, what's the background of the technologies, but also what the behavior change scientists call social proof, which is everyone you know is getting it, everyone you respect is getting it, people like you are getting it, and all these sorts of things that built the case in people's heads that it was an entirely normal, safe and reasonable thing to do, so that when they saw a conspiracy theory about it, it bounced off them. And that was tremendously successful. And I think similarly in beating dictatorships, the thing we need to think about is not how do we stop their crazy lies, because they're going to say those whatever happens. but much more, how can we get the truth to people first? Independent media is obviously a crucial part of that. What we're adding to that is boosting the reach of it. So that's really our role. Our role isn't to report the truth, it's to help people who are reporting the truth to get it to more people.
Yeah, that's a fantastic phrase to, I think, conclude on. Lastly, you've got a huge army of volunteers that help out experts, but you're also dependent on donations. And I can see you're quite close to the target you originally set, but this war is obviously lasting a lot longer perhaps than most people expected. So the last thing is, what do you need in the coming weeks and months?
We need more money. It's very simple. £10 can pay to show 1,000 ads in Russia. So about a penny per ad. Sometimes it's cheaper, sometimes it's more expensive, but that's what we do. Everything we do is done by volunteers. And so your money, if it's donated, goes straight into those ads with nobody taking any of that. So if people go to the crowdfunder page, then they can donate any amount of money and we'll be spending it very, very quickly. In fact, we are nearly out of money at the moment. So every penny you donate will get spent very, very quickly after you donate it.
And I highly recommend people doing this. As we've said, government is not necessarily very effective or investing in this area. And it's something Navalny's and his team believe, and they are incredible media experts. They do believe this is an area that it really should be scaling up. Rob, thank you so much for spending so much time here. I wish your campaign success, and I hope that we can help get the funds to keep it going for the duration of this conflict.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.